I've noticed a trend as I've recently started engaging in Muslim content. A lot of Muslim apologists, and I'll say that again, apologists won't tell you these things about the Quran's traditions and how the development of this has happened. Most of your average Muslims have no clue about this. But Dr. Shady Nasser takes us through the literature, and let me know what you think about it. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. This is a very interesting point that you make. I don't know why I always reflect back to my biblical studies to make an analogy for anyone watching this.
Yeah.
We have what we see as the canon now. But during like the first century, for example, various versions of Judaism had various, if you could use the term, canons. They didn't actually go by a standard, this is what we use. They had Enoch. They had all sorts of different, some of the stuff you'd go, that's not in our Bible. We don't allow that in our Bible. They did. So they used whatever text. And so eventually a standardization, canonization, eventually develops in all of these systems, including Judaism, Christianity, and I suspect, based on your books, also Islam. And this is wonderful, though. This points out that earlier, there's no reason, even in the tradition, to make the assumption that Muhammad had the whole Quran collected. Now, one might argue in some way, well, he had it in memory and he shared it by word of mouth, orally to other people, but that comes to the question, did he really receive, or is this tradition developed over time by Muslim early scholars who are developing this movement, creating a collection and then canonizing what they call the Quran?
I mean, again, a valid question, and we don't have a clear answer, right? So we don't have sources directly that go directly back to this period, right? So most of our sources, they come 150 years later, reports on that period. We don't have direct. We do have eyewitnesses. We can talk about this also a little bit. So we do trust many of these accounts of what was happening. And why do we trust this? Because we have so many conflicting reports. So if you have one beautiful standard report about something that happened, you always have doubts. But when you have many conflicting reports, you have a general story or a general account, but then the details, people differ on the details. That's a healthy sign. That's not a bad sign. It tells you that generally there is something that people are agreeing on, but they differ on the details.
Right.
You see? So it's the same with the Quran. We can talk about the variant readings later on. So my position is it's a healthy sign that the Quran has variants. It's not a bad thing. If it doesn't, I would be very skeptical about how far the text goes. If it has variants, it tells me that the text is old.
Right.
And that's, a rule of thumb, for any text that is transmitted orally. Same with poetry. If you have poetry which has variants and it's transmitted by different people with variations, it tells you that the poetry is old. If you have one standard version of a poem, it means that it's not old and it's
canonized, right?
It's standardized or canonized, right?
Yeah.
So same thing with historical narratives. So you have a general narrative with many with discrepancies. That's a great sign. We want discrepancies. We don't want one beautiful standard, narration of what happened, back then. And that's, the reason why we have, these 3, 4, 5 different accounts of how the Quran was collected. They all share, if you want, a backbone, of truth, in a sense, of probably, something true about what happened, but they differ in the details. And then we start asking these, questions. So what does it mean that, people, this companion, Zayd, he was saying, well, how dare we do something that the Prophet didn't do? And then it raises the question about the Quran. What is it? Is it Should it be just an oral text? Should it be just selections of recitations? Should it be really a standardized, canonized book? And these questions people ask them. Okay, why didn't the Prophet didn't die suddenly? Okay, he was 63, 64 years old. According to tradition, he predicted his death, or he knew he was dying. He could have said, okay, I'm going to collect the Quran and make a final version of it before I die. Why didn't he do that if it's important to have it written down? Right.
And let me ask you this, in light of this is wonderful. That makes perfect sense. He obviously wasn't concerned about this. If this concern starts to develop, I think, and this is me, just my common sense based on other examples in history that I've looked at. When you have Abu Bakr come on the scene, you have his 3 sons. Muhammad's 3 sons are too young. They're not able, so they marry Abu Bakr's daughters, I think it is, and like there seems to be a political struggle for power, as well as who's going to be the guy, the head honcho. We need to get the narrative under control. I'm thinking in human terms on how we would naturally come to explain this. So here you have someone who goes, we need to have full control of the narrative. We need to have something standardized. And I wonder if they learned this. Maybe this is just something in the air for common sense for people, or they saw how the Jews and Christians that were living in the region, that wasn't something, I've heard people try to say they weren't living it. Yes, there were Jews.
No, you have a good common sense as well, because in the same narrative, speaking of that, in this same account, or in an offshoot account, after they made the first collection. Okay, so Zayd, he went around and then he started asking, other companions, okay, tell me what you memorized. And then he started writing them down. At the end, according to one narrative, so Abu Bakr, they put the collection in front of him. And then he said, what should we call it?
Wow.
Right? So what should we call? See, it's again, it doesn't matter whether this account is made up or not. It tells you something about even the person who fabricated the account or who transmitted it. It tells you about how people were thinking back then. Or so he says, what should we call it? Again, see, this is the distinction between something written and something recited. And then one answered, he said, why don't we call it what did he say? The Torah, or I forgot which term he gave. It's like, let's call it the Torah, or let's call it the scripture or Injil. And then he said, no, this is what the Jews call their scripture. Right. We don't want to call it the same. So, but back to your point about knowing what was happening. Of course, they knew what was happening. Arabia was not just an isolated, place where they had no contact with what's happening around them. And then someone suggested that, okay, so why don't we call it Mus'haf, Codex? This is what they call it in Ethiopia, the Mus'haf, right? And they said, okay, so that's a good. So let's call it a Mus'haf. They didn't even call it Quran. They call it Mus'haf. It's just a codex. And that's from back then, not necessarily, again, the account, whether it's early or whether it's, made up 100, 150 years later. It tells you that from very, very early on, there was a distinction between the written text and the orally performed text. They are two distinct entities that people should realize that they are different, at least from a theological perspective. Now, you as a practical person say, what's the difference? What we have written is the same as what you are reciting. Okay, from a practical purposes, it's the same. But from a theological perspective, the codex, the reality of the codex is very different from the reality of the recited text. Okay. So, So one of the, for example, back to the issues or discrepancies. So this account, has certain discrepancies with some other accounts. So we have other accounts that said, several of them, not just one or two, that the Prophet had scribes. Okay, and whenever he received revelations, he would ask the scribes to write them down. to write these revelations down. And there are many of these accounts. So there are even there is a list of the name of the people who were able to read and write, these revelations. And there are also other accounts that he would instruct, people to put this verse in front of that verse. When he received the revelations later on, no, put it in this chapter or that chapter. Again, whether these accounts are true or not, that's not the issue here. But then the question is, if we already have so many accounts about the Prophet making certain kind of arrangements or a certain, if you want, personal collections. So what was the purpose of this first collection? Mm-hmm. Why did, the head of the committee why did he go around and started asking other companions about verses that they memorized, or looking for things written on leaves of trees and camel shoulders and flat stones? Yep. This is the narrative, right? If the Prophet already had scribes and he had already instructed them to write certain chapters down, okay? And again, there are many interpretations of this. Any contradiction, you can solve it. It's not an issue to solve contradictions in tradition. I'm sure you know that also.
There's always reconciling.
You can always reconcile any two contradictory accounts. That's not the issue. But again, we ask questions. So what's the purpose of of these accounts about early collections and this first collection, right? And a second point is that this image that this account gives about the condition of the writing culture in Arabia, it gives you a very primordial, if you want, Jurassic image of how people were reading and writing, as if they only had flat stones and camel shoulders and leaves of trees to write on. And we already know that they were in touch with other cultures, and they could afford. Yes, paper was expensive, and but the image that the account gives you, it tells you that this is the first book.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.